Hello everyone, welcome back to the class of macroeconomics. In today's class, we want to talk about some more macro facts, and then we are going to have a brief discussion about the building blocks of the Keynesian analysis. So to begin with, in today's lecture, we are going to address the following questions. We want to ask what is the relationship between inflation rate and unemployment rate. We will also ask about the relationship between the inflation rate and the output growth rate. And then we are going to ask, can we learn from the history and resolve some of the macro issues? And then we want to ask why we can analyze an economy without money. And then we want to see how we can do macro analysis using the Keynesian approach. Therefore, the outline for today is as follows. We want to first talk about the Phillips curve, which will be able to address the relationship between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. Then we are going to talk about the sacrifice ratio, which is going to show the relationship between the inflation rate and the output growth rate. And then we are going to talk about Lucas' critique, which will be able to address the issue when we want to look at a history and see if we can learn from history and then provide some of the policy recommendations and then what we need to do. Then we are going to talk about the classical dichotomy, which will tell us why we can analyze a macro model without money. Finally, we are going to introduce the building blocks of the Keynesian model, which will then allow us to conduct the Keynesian type of the analysis for some of the macro events. So now let's explore what is the relationship between the unemployment rate and the inflation rate. As you can see from here that we show the data about the relationship between the unemployment rate and the inflation rate, we will see that there exists a negative relationship between the two variables. In fact, this relationship has been already proposed by Phillips in 1958. In his paper published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics in 1958, it says that there exists a negative relationship between the nominal wage rate and the unemployment rate. The people after him interpret this result as the negative relationship between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. Therefore, people term this relationship as the Phillips curve. We say that this curve describes the negative relationship between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. So then later on, people question about the existence of such a relationship. And Freeman and Phillips are the researchers that based on the mathematical derivations and find out that the negative relationship between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate in fact does not necessarily exist. That is because they find out that from the model perspective, they suggest that the true relationship is between the unexpected inflation rate and the cyclical unemployment rate. Therefore, they provide a new relationship in which we call it the Expectation-augmented Phillips curve. This theory, in fact, been developed before the failure of the Phillips curve in 1970s. So basically, based on their research, they show that the relationship between inflation rate and the unemployment rate in fact not stable. The true relationship exists between the unexpected inflation rate, which is the difference between the actual and the expected inflation rate, and the cyclical unemployment rate, which is the difference between the actual unemployment rate and the natural rate of unemployment. And then so in fact, they find out the true relationship before the Phillips curve in fact show up to be no longer hold when we look at the data afterwards. So now let's look at the data for about the inflation rate and unemployment rate after the 1970s. As you can see from this graph, that the vertical axis shows the inflation rate and the horizontal axis shows the unemployment rate. We see that if we plot the scatter plot for these two variables for the data after 1970, we find out this negative relationship no longer holds. And then so if we modify the computation of the Phillips curve, which is about the relationship between the inflation and unemployment rate, into the relationship between the unexpected inflation rate and the cyclical unemployment, and then we will find out that the negative relationship again restored. Therefore, we want to ask then why the Phillips curve hold for the data before the 1960s. So then we want to ask the questions, why before the 1970s the negative relationship between the unemployment rate and inflation rate holds, but then after the 1970s it doesn't. A quick answer for that is that there is a shifting of the Phillips curve such that if we look at the data after 1970s, then it doesn't hold anymore. So we say that the factors that shifting the Phillips curve are as follows. It can be the changes of the expected inflation rate, or it can be due to the changes in the natural rate of unemployment such that it causes the Phillips curve to shift. When Phillips curve shifts, then the negative relationship between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate then no longer holds. And now let's take a look at the graph to illustrate when the expected inflation rate and the natural rate of unemployment got changed, then how does it affect the shifting of the Phillips curve? We want to first again examine the expectation-augmented Phillips curve in detail. We say that based on the expectation-augmented Phillips curve, we say that the true relationship between inflation rate and the unemployment rate is between the unexpected inflation rate and the cyclical unemployment rate. So in here, the pi e is the expected inflation rate, the u bar is the natural rate of unemployment, the u minus u bar is the cyclical unemployment. Later on, I will denote it as U tilde, and the pi minus pi e is the unanticipated inflation rate, which later on I will denote it as pi tilde. So then in here, what we are going to have is that if we are given a set of the pi e and u bar, which is that if we keep these two numbers exactly the same over time, then the true relationship, which is between the cyclical unemployment rate and the unanticipated inflation rate, will be boiled down to the relationship between the pi and u. And therefore, when the economy has the expected inflation rate and the natural rate of unemployment remain roughly constant, then even though the true relationship holds between cyclical unemployment and the unanticipated inflation rate, we will still observe the negative relationship between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. Therefore, here I say if given a set of the pi e and u, the negative relationship also holds between pi and u, and which is described by the Phillips curve. So then now we want to argue that if there is a changes in the expected inflation rate and the natural rate of unemployment, then it will shift the Phillips curve, and we want to see how well it shifts the Phillips curve. So to begin with, we say when we allow the expected inflation rate and the natural rate of unemployment rate got changed, then we can insert another term, which is delta pi e and delta u bar, which indicates the changes in the expected inflation rate and the natural rate of unemployment. Therefore, the true relationship between inflation and the unemployment rate still holds between the cyclical unemployment rate and the unexpected inflation rate. But then we need to add in another term, which is minus delta pi e for inflation rate and minus delta u bar for the unemployment rate. Therefore, in graph, we say if we are given a set of the expected inflation rate and the natural rate of unemployment, then we are going to get the negative relationship between pi and u, because pi is the actual inflation rate, which is the summing up of the unexpected inflation rate plus the expected inflation rate. and the U is equaling the cyclical unemployment rate plus the natural rate of unemployment. And then given that the pi e and U bar are exactly the same, therefore, even though the true relationship or true negative relationship between pi tilde and U tilde now can also shown between the relationship for the pi, which is the inflation rate, and the U, which is the unemployment rate. So then now, if we allow the expected inflation rate to increase, then it means that the true inflation rate will be the unexpected inflation rate plus the expected inflation rate, and then add up another term, which is the increase of the expected inflation rate. Because of that, we can say, given the same level of the U bar, which is the natural rate of unemployment, then we are going to have a higher inflation rate for every point on top of the black line. Therefore, it is saying that the Phillips curve will shift to the right when the expected inflation rate got increased. It also happened similarly when there is an increase in the natural rate of unemployment. Again, in this graph, we know if we are given a set of the expected inflation rate and the natural rate of unemployment, there exists a negative relationship between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. Then, if the natural rate of unemployment got increased, then the actual unemployment rate will then equal to the cyclical unemployment rate plus the natural rate of unemployment, and then plus another term, which is the increase of the natural rate of unemployment. Therefore, it tells us that if we are given a level of the inflation rate, then for every point on top of the black line, it will have a higher unemployment rate. Therefore, it shifts the Phillips curve to the right. Therefore, in conclusion, we show that when there is either an increase in the expected inflation rate or there is an increase in the natural rate of unemployment rate, both of them will cause the Phillips curve to shift to the right. Okay, so then we already know why the changes in the expected inflation rate and the natural rate of unemployment causes the shifting of the Phillips curve. Now we want to ask why in 1970s Phillips curve no longer hold. Okay, so in here we show that what happened in the 1970s is that there is oil price shock in the 1973 to 74 and 1979 to 80, which causes the oil price to change a lot. Thus, it changes the expected inflation rate. Given that the expected inflation rate got changed, so the Phillips curve got shifts. Another reason for why the Phillips curve relationship got failed after the 1970s is because of the expansionary monetary policy adopted in the US. Because of that, it leads to a more volatile expected inflation rate. Therefore, again, it shifts the Phillips curve to the right. Finally, in US, because the composite of the labor force got changed, for example, there are more women entering the labor market. Therefore, it also changes the natural rate of unemployment. Because of that, it raised the natural rate of unemployment rate somehow, and thus it also shifts the Phillips curve to the right. Therefore, there's a couple events happen in the 1970s causes the expected inflation rate and the natural rate of unemployment rate to increase. Thus, it shifts the Phillips curve and causes the failure of the traditional Phillips curve. So then the next question we want to ask is, can Phillips curve be exploited by policy makers? When the policy makers look at the Phillips curve relationship, they will say, hey, there exists a negative relationship between the unemployment rate and the inflation rate. So then if the unemployment rate is way too high, then we probably can raise the inflation rate such that we will be able to lower the unemployment rate because there exists a negative relationship between the two. So then we want to ask, can this relationship be exploited by policymakers to resolve some of the unemployment issues. It turned out that the classical view says no. That is because based on the classical approach, we know that we allow the economy to form the perfect expectations. Other than that, we also allow the price to adjust rapidly. Therefore, when people can form the rational expectation, then their expected inflation rate will then be the realized inflation rate because their expectation is correct. Because of that, the unemployment rate will return to the natural level quickly. So then the gap between the expected inflation rate and the actual inflation rate somehow will shrink at a really short time. Therefore, it implies that the deviation of the unemployment rate from the natural rate of unemployment also will last only for a short time. Because of that, under the classical view, the policymaker cannot exploit this relationship easily. However, based on the Keynesian view, the answer will be yes, that the policymaker will be able to exploit this relationship temporarily. That is because the key assumption of the Keynesian view is that the price is sticky and then it takes time for people to reform in their expectation. Therefore, the expected inflation rate can deviate away from the actual inflation rate. So the gap between the inflation rate and the expected inflation rate can remain for a relatively longer time. So then because of that, the policymaker will be able to take advantage of this gap and then perturbing the unemployment rate. However, in the long run, we say that the unemployment will be roughly at the level of the natural rate of unemployment because in the long run, we are ignoring the cyclicals. And we say that in the long run, what people expect will be realized anyhow. Even though in the short run, the Keynesian view believes that the actual inflation rate can deviate away from the expected inflation rate, but in the long run, they will coincide. Therefore, the unemployment rate will then go back to the natural rate of unemployment in the long run. So then we argue that in the long run, the relationship between inflation rate and the unemployment rate is that in the long run, the unemployment rate will stay at the natural rate of unemployment, but then the inflation rate can at any level because the inflation rate depends on the government's monetary policy. And that will be the long run Phillips curve, which is a vertical line. Okay, so then what are the policy implications of the long run Phillips curve? It tells us that the changes in the level and the growth rate of the money supply will only cause the inflation, which is consistent with the quantity theory of money we learned before. Other than that, we say that the changes in the level and growth of the money supply will not have a long-run real effect. That is, it will not affect the long-run unemployment rate because the long-run unemployment rate is need to be equal the natural rate of unemployment. So the bottom line is that if the government wants to adopt the expansionary monetary policy to reduce the unemployment rate, it is at most can reduce it temporarily because based on the Keynesian view, this relationship can only be explored in the short run but not in the long run because in the long run, the increase in the money will only cause the inflation and it will not affect the labor market equilibrium. Therefore, the policy implication is that in the long run, the government cannot exploit the Phillips curve relationship anymore.